All right, so you recently co-authored a three-part series on Bitcoin and stablecoin with Mark Goodwin, and he summed up the core thesis in an article recently. Bitcoin will circumnavigate the government and separate money from the state, while stablecoins aim to strengthen the dollar as the world's reserve currency, provide much needed demand for government issued debt reserves, and further perpetuate the US dollar as the de facto medium of exchange to the unbanked citizens of the globe. At the surface, Bitcoin and the digital dollar appear as if oil and water, unable to coexist in the same space and molecularly opposed. And yet, collectively, the dollar and Bitcoin are to form the backbone for an entirely new financial system, a yin and yang construction that allows an entirely new commodity class to coexist with a hyper dollarized world. Okay, can you explain how the adoption of stablecoin and the adoption of Bitcoin are going to help to stop the tide of de dollarization?
Yeah, so it's really a two-part system. So it involves sort of yoking the dollar in a de facto way to Bitcoin, and then basically boosting the price of Bitcoin through the roof, essentially, as a way to sort of allow the U.S. government to debt pardon itself. And one of the reasons, well, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, so I'll come back to that later. But basically, we've had so many wealth transfers in this country. We're at the point where the robber barons, the elite bankers, whatever you want to call them, have basically stolen everything. So now that they have everything, they want to move to deflationary money. And so the only problem they have left the only hurdle left to cross, right, is sort of this extreme U.S. government debt crisis that is about to be upon the United States and essentially been admitted by big-time congressmen like Paul Ryan very recently. And one of the ways Paul Ryan pitched getting out of that problem was starting to regulate dollar stable coins, many of which have now surpassed several nation states as the biggest holders of U.S. treasuries or, U.S. government debt in the world, right? So you have like the biggest dollar stablecoin like Tether now holding, more treasuries than, well, I forget exactly where it is in the ranking, but it's bigger than Germany and some other countries that have significant amounts of reserves. Unfortunately, I don't have the figures at the top of my head right now, but it's a very easy search to find those exact numbers, but it's very significant and being talked about pretty widely. So stablecoins are becoming a way for the U.S. government to service its debt, and this is sort of being done in throughout Latin America, especially where you have sort of this de facto, what I would call sort of covert dollarization happening. So like you wreck an economy like Argentina via the IMF, for example, which the U.S. military and documents published by WikiLeaks several years ago was referred to as a financial weapon of U.S. empire, right? So if you like wreck an economy and you destroy their currency, and then people flock to Tether or USDC or some other because they can't get their hand on physical dollars, they can get their hand on virtual dollars, and that's happening in a big way in a lot of these economies that have become increasingly destabilized, arguably on purpose, by the U.S. power structure. And then you have them becoming de facto dollarized as opposed to sort of formal dollarization, which took place decades ago in places like Ecuador, El Salvador, where those countries essentially lose a significant amount of their financial sovereignty because they're sort of at the whim of the Federal Reserve, which they have zero control over, right? So I'm not sure what else to add there. I sort of gave
So you're
review,
okay.
but the goal.
So you're saying in a case like that, all right, so their currency's been destroyed partly through IMF policy or entirely. So
or World Bank or the multilateral development banking system among, there's these vulture capitalist figures that have been a big issue in Argentina as well. Most of them are American, like Paul Singer, for example, is probably one of the most notorious. BlackRock is also one. And Javier Milei in Argentina has been making, deals with them. Yeah, he doesn't say afuera to BlackRock. or JP Morgan, or, plenty of other, or Silicon Valley. He's like, no, take over our government, please. It's kind of funny. He's like, yeah, like libertarians cheer him on because he's like, I'm going to get rid of the Ministry of Education. It's wasteful. And that, maybe it is. I don't know. I'm not an expert on waste and, the Ministry of Education in Argentina, but he's pitched replacing it with Facebook's AI to train everyone in, all the young people in Argentina for the future of work. That doesn't sound like a great alternative to me.
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, is that like doctrinaire libertarianism? I mean, libertarianism has become so self-contradictory at this point. Like, I don't know who the libertarians are, who the tech right are. It seems like libertarianism allows for infinite expansion of tech power, which I guess he's for.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Because I think there was a deliberate effort by people like Peter Thiel, for example, and these Silicon Valley figures that frame themselves as libertarian to sort of hijack what people used to consider libertarianism, which was like a lot of concern about decreasing the size of government, maximizing freedom, maximizing civil liberty, things like that. That is not Peter Thiel libertarianism, like, at all. But because he's sort of been able to mask himself as that, it's allowed him to sort of develop this other brand of libertarianism that you could argue is sort of taking over, or really overshadowing the other type that perhaps, may have been more prominent in some circles a few decades ago. Right. Because there was a lot of commonality between anti-war left and sort of anti-war libertarians. And now that ability, that bridge that existed between those two groups is becoming it's being attacked. It's definitely been attacked. And there's a lot of libertarians now with this current faction that's coming into power that are very much cheering on what, seems very clearly to be an expansion of government, actually, and the surveillance state,
Yeah, well, it seems like their agenda is standard kind of Republican stuff, shrink the state in favor of corporate power, only with this 21st century tech bro paint job, where you're really moving towards a kind of feudalism. It really, because a government of billionaires where you have unelected people deciding what to cut from the government, and it seems like most of what they want to cut are things that restrain their power. I mean, what is that? That's a move towards a feudal system.
Well, I do want to point out really quick, so I think DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is really a Trojan horse for putting as much of government in the hands of AI as possible. And I think when you do that, that doesn't necessarily mean smaller government, right? Perhaps less humans in the workforce, but having like AI run all these different departments and programs and whatever doesn't necessarily mean the government is shrinking. It can mean the government human workforce is shrinking, but it's not necessarily the same thing. So we'll have to pay close attention to how that develops over time, because I suspect someone like Elon Musk, for example, who obviously has positioned himself to have undue power, considering that no one voted for him, is a big proponent of carbon taxes and carbon markets and a lot of stuff that conservatives and libertarians certainly don't like, and certainly would be an expansion of government. You're creating a whole new market, essentially, that civilians and corporations alike would have to play in order to meet, those quotas or however they choose to set it up. And I think ultimately it's very, very problematic putting AI in charge of government. It's actually something that Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger cheered on in their book, The Age of AI, Our Human Future, a very misleading title. It's about the post-human future that they envision. And basically, the way they sort of describe it, and I would recommend people read the book for themselves, but I sort of, my interpretation of it is that it's the ultimate kind of Wizard of Oz cover for the government to get away with whatever it wants. And honestly, like Henry Kissinger's wet dream. No wonder he was so excited about AI, because essentially, you can claim that, they argue that AI will become so much more intelligent than humans and think so differently that it could never explain how it reaches its conclusions to people, which envisions a future of computer says no, computer says yes, computer issues it, and you can't question it. It can't explain itself. We must trust that it's, in a kind of a religious way, that it's so much smarter than anything else. So if it says, Nuki ran for example, and and then they get in trouble for it or something. They'll be like, well, it was the computer and it's so much more intelligent than us humans. I mean, that's basically a way for them to get away with whatever they want. Just be like, well, actually the super intelligent artificial general intelligence that's smarter than God himself told us to do it, and we can't question that now, can we? I mean, that's basically sort of the setup. And, hopefully that's not the same thing Elon Musk and Ramaswamy have in mind, but I don't know. I mean, the lines between Eric Schmidt world and Peter Thiel verse world are actually pretty thin. They're both on the steering committee of the Bilderberg conference, and they agree on a lot more than they don't. They're both very closely aligned with the Department of Defense as it comes to AI. Eric Schmidt basically wrote the game plan for how national security would use AI as head of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence a few years ago. And of course, Peter Thiel, through many of his companies and the company he backs, is a major military contractor with a lot of ties to the national security state. And of course, not just the Department of Defense in Thiel's case, but also the CIA. And, they're really not that different in the end of the day. I think their sales pitches are different and how they frame stuff is different. So this particular camp that sort of claimed that they're the Silicon Valley libertarians are cloaking themselves in a lot of words like innovation, efficiency, and all of this stuff. But the problem is, AI as an industry is very overhyped. So for example, you could have a company say, like one company I wrote about during COVID-19 is an Israeli company called Diagnostic Robotics. And so they were picked by the Rhode Island governor at the time, who later became Biden's commerce secretary, to basically predict COVID outbreaks before they happen in Rhode Island. And they said themselves that their algorithm was roughly like 75% accurate, but that's like, the company's opinion. Right. That wasn't independently vetted or anything. So it's probably closer to 60 or 50%, like a coin toss. So is it really more efficient to put an algorithm like that in charge of deciding public health policy, or if a particular community is locked down and its economic activity halted or something like that? That's just one example. I mean, obviously AI is being applied to every sector, but there's been a lot of grift in this particular field, and it's also happened with a former DARPA director had sort of a defense tech company. Her name's Regina Dugan when Obama was in power, and they got basically outed for having that. I think it was for detecting IEDs or the probability of them or something. I forget exactly what it was about, but it was found to literally be like a fraudulent algorithm. It was no better than a coin toss, and nothing happened to her. So this type of stuff happens in government all the time. And just because Elon Musk and Ramaswamy are at the helm of it doesn't mean that's going to happen. Specifically, when you look at Vivek Ramaswamy's, track record in pharma world of pump and dumps and things like that, this type of waste can still happen even if the government workforce is smaller. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what those policies are. But it's important to note that those people at Doge, and also, David Sachs is the AI crypto czar, who's also part of the PayPal mafia. None of them, as far as I know, have to divest from their investment interests.
Right, they're not elected.
Yeah, well, speaking of the PayPal mafia, that gets into the next piece that I wanted to bring up with you. Welcome to the Jimmy, in case you want to cut this in, Andrew. Welcome to the Jimmy Dore Show, everybody. Keaton Weiss and Russell Dobler here in for Jimmy with special guest Whitney Webb. And I want to talk about Elon Musk introducing the sort of X social credit score, if you will. But as a lead into that, I thought I should show you this. Whitney, you commented on this. Linda Yaccarino, technically, of course, the CEO of X, says in 2024, X changed the world. Now you are the media. 2025, X will connect you in ways never thought possible. X TV, X money, Grok, and more. And so Alex Finn quote tweets that Linda announces X payments coming in 2025. And you commented on this. Won't it be fun when you disagree with Musk's politics and he not only punishes your account socially, but also financially? American WeChat, Musk's explicit original vision for this platform, really is taking shape. It might have a MAGA sticker on it, but it will be the same surveillance, social credit bullshit, just courtesy of the PayPal mafia instead of Chinese state adjacent firms. For what it's worth, the PayPal mafia are very, very state adjacent too, and essentially have been since PayPal was created. You continue on. If you are one of those people who think the PayPal mafia are our elites, quote unquote, even though they are the same Bilderberg crop and deep state gophers as the rest of them, I guess you'll not only give them your brain in a bag, but your wallet too. Enjoy all the freedom they bring you. Then a few days later, Elon introduces an algorithm tweak coming soon to promote more informational / entertaining content. We will publish the changes to X engineering. Our goal is to maximize unregretted user seconds. Too much negativity towards me is being pushed that technically grows. I'm sorry. Too much. I'm sorry. Did I make too much negativity is being pushed? Sorry, I added that. Sometimes you see things that aren't there. It's just one of the things I have. Too much negativity is being pushed that technically grows over user time, but not unregretted user time. And so people started putting into Grok, hey, what is my X social credit score? What is my X score? And as you can see, Shadow of Ezra gets a 38 out of 100, which I got as well. Apparently, a lot of people are getting 38 out of 100. Our friend Misty Winston, welcome to the new social credit system. Y'all still think Elon is based. So she's got a 38 out of 100 as well. Sam Tripoli, who's a friend of the Jimmy Dore show, says, this is scary. I asked Grok how I could get my social credit score up, and this was its response. To improve your social credit score, consider the following strategies. Won't read all this. I'll just read the headings. Positive behavior, paying fines and bills on time, online behavior, hello, engage with approved systems, continuous learning and improvement, compliance with government guidelines. Remember, the specifics can vary, blah, blah, blah. Okay, there's the disclaimers in the fine print at the bottom. But it's kind of funny how just a few days after you fired off these couple of warning tweets, not only do we have the X payments introduced at the end of the year, but then Elon rolls out his own version of an online social credit score type system. So you've contended that a big goal of big tech is to basically act as an information gathering tool on all of us and a sort of unofficial surveillance.
It was created. Yeah, it was created to be that, but I think they're expanding now. And now they also want social media platforms, the legacy ones, the conventional ones, X, Twitter included, to basically merge with banking. And I think that is ultimately the goal. So, because ultimately they want to move to a cashless, completely surveillable society. This has been outlined by a lot of people, including the head of the BIS, for example. And it's obviously been a major focus of U.S. intelligence for decades and decades and decades. Definitely not something new there. And obviously, with the PayPal mafia in particular, looking at people like Peter Thiel, he and his other co-founders at Palantir, sought to privatize a program that was at DARPA at the time, just part of the military, and was being shut down because of how it was basically eliminating the constitutional right for privacy for all Americans. And he reprivatized that and created Palantir explicitly. That's exactly what happened. There's really no doubt about it if you look at the evidence. And this was something dreamed up right after 9/11 by the neocons. So really, I would argue that those guys, they're rebranded neocons, and the goal of the neocons and that particular, the people that did Iran-Contra, it's the same people. The guy that was running this particular program at DARPA was the highest ranking member of the Reagan administration to be arrested as part of and indicted as part of Iran-Contra, John Poindexter, who is also considered the godfather of modern surveillance. What do you know? But a lot of those guys, and a lot of the terrible stuff they did abroad, starting with things like, the Phoenix program, Operation Condor, and all of that, sort of these efforts to clamp down on dissidents and authoritarian regimes, a lot of it used computers, used databases, and used building profiles on people. And this particular group in Iran-Contra, Poindexter included, were involved with developing this system called Main Core, which has never really gone away. It was seen in use after 9/11 at the White House by people. And as of 2008, which is the last time any sort of mainstream organization reported on it, it had 3 million Americans on it. So essentially, Palantir is the tool used by U.S. intelligence to determine if you end up on that list or not. And and basically, these continuity of government protocols, of which this is part, can decide if you have your constitutional rights suspended if a vaguely defined national emergency is declared at some point. And in the Reagan era, some of these national emergency scenarios included mass nonviolent protests, really, against U.S. military intervention abroad. So a very large anti-war protest, for example. But, lucky for the U.S. government, those don't really happen anymore, I guess. This particular group, talking about Thiel in particular, but he and Musk maintain close ties, and Musk is building, the satellite system for the intelligence community. This gets left out a lot of the time, and is the main contractor for the Pentagon Space Force and also other aspects of the Pentagon. And most of the satellites in the sky are really under his control. His cars, the electric vehicles, whether it's a regular Tesla or a Cybertruck, are basically surveillance vehicles. This has sort of come out in the wake of a lot of this information about the Cybertruck bomber thing at the Trump hotel or whatever, where he was saying, well, it couldn't have been on autopilot because you have to be filmed and surveilled by this camera, and it has to detect an attentive driver for you to put anything in autopilot. Basically, it's very ironic that people sort of see him as an anti-establishment figure. But again, it's because I think Americans are very easily hypnotized by rhetoric, and they ignore policy action or what people actually do. And they get so swept up in the image, often false image, that's projected out publicly, whether on social media or other forms of mass media, and sort of fall for that facade that's constructed. And when you're the richest person in the world, you can hire a lot of help to make you the best facade possible.
Well, that's the
and
thing.
spread
Like
it as far as wide.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I was going to say, when you look at the consolidation of capital and the expansion of tech, neither of those exist in coincidence with the other randomly, I don't think. And you look at something like this, not only is it going to be more and more difficult to distinguish where tech ends and the state begins, it's going to matter less. It's not going to matter where you draw that line,
Right.
because you're going to have so much of this capability in private hands that no matter what the state is, there's going to be so much power that is just transferred behind the curtain, if you will, to these giant tech companies. They're going to have the same surveillance power as the state, if not more. And now maybe they already do.
I think they already do. I think over the past decade and a half, maybe even more, really a lot of these companies have fully merged with the national security state in very significant ways. I mean, honestly, our intelligence community today could not really function without Palantir. Right. And a lot of, and now and the whole border wall plan for Trump, when he was in office first time, he abandoned the physical wall idea and wanted to build the virtual border wall, which conveniently is constructed by Palmer Luckey, who's a Peter Thiel protege, whose company Anduril that's building it, the defense contractor, is building the virtual border wall. It's also building all of these drone swarms that the U.S. military is projected to need, a bazillion of these automated drone swarms and slaughter bots and whatever, like all of this very dystopian weapon tech. It's all being built by these people. And again, it's going to be pitched to the American public as this is more efficient. This is innovation and this is efficiency. Less American soldiers will die. And instead of it taking us 10 years to kill 1 million innocent Iraqis, we could do it in a month. That's basically, the sales pitch. More wars faster, more efficient wars, but really aren't people fed up with the foreign wars? Shouldn't it be no foreign wars? But this is how, they trick people. Eric Prince, the CIA death squad leader of Blackwater, has rebranded himself as some kind of guy that's concerned about military industrial complex efficiency. And he's hoodwinked a lot of people. Blackwater was not efficient when it was a U.S. Military and intelligence contractor, and it committed a lot of crimes, was involved in a lot of things that people on left and right should really still be outraged against, or outraged about, years later. But he successfully sort of been the tip of the spear and sort of leading that kind of argument, and it's become very, very, very pervasive. And that's particularly true with this incoming administration. And so I think, people would do well to point that out, that it's not really, we shouldn't be worried about fighting more efficient wars. We should stop having them entirely, really.
All right. So let's look at some of how they get people believing all of this. And you've been speaking about this a lot. Since the attacks on New Year's Eve, we've seen a lot of things that look like transparent narrative management. They literally sent a reporter into the apartment of an alleged terrorist with chemicals sitting on the table and open Qurans. It was just it was about as convincing as the CNN video in
where she sniffs
in
the backpack with sarin gas. Yep.
Yeah,
That's exactly what I was thinking of. Yeah.
It was so stage managed. It was absurd. It was almost insulting. It felt like they're just not even trying anymore. So now not long before this, you have Sean Ryan, who's former Navy SEAL, former CIA contractor. Now he's out there in the independent media. And he went on Rogan, borders, Al-Qaeda's coming over the borders. And then he suggests that the Democrats are just doing it because they want the voters, which Joe, to his credit, saw something a little more sinister. So we're just going to look at the end of this clip.
I think it's by design, from the government, but I think that I think that the government is more incompetent than it's ever been before. And I think they have one common goal, and that I think the goal is voting. They want them to vote, but I don't think they're competent enough to realize the death and destruction and the other repercussions that we're going to face by keeping that border open. Because they don't have anybody, that they don't have anybody with any experience that they don't have any solid intelligence stuff going on that's telling them, like, hey, this is what's going to happen. It's all agenda driven.
Jesus Christ.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense that all they care about is voting, is get the people in, don't worry about the consequences. But the more insidious conspiracy would be that they want unrest, because it gives them an opportunity to clamp down on rights.
I mean, shit, though. Unrest.
He pushes right back on that.
They got really good at unrest. You know what I mean? In 2020, right? All through, or even before 2020. Up to that election. So I don't think they need to import terrorism.
Yeah, but it's a
and
different kind of
cartels.
unrest. The kind of unrest that you get from people blowing up Target is very different than the kind of unrest you get from a legitimate terror attack.
Yeah.
All right, so Joe's almost there, which he doesn't seem to like. He really does not want to go in that direction. So you responded to this clip. You said, please remember the history of the last 25 years and recognize this for what it is. Repackaged neocon slop brought to you by former spooks to get you to surrender your remaining freedoms in the name of fighting the war on domestic terror with consent manufactured via an American Gladio-style op using the same fucking CIA boogeymen as 2001 to 2003. All right, and lo and behold, Ryan winds up being the person who is the recipient of the Tesla bombers manifesto, and then he does this whole theatrical thing. I'm disappearing for a few days with my family because I don't know what's going to happen to me after I release this. So, but this person
Cinema.
Yeah, he's presenting himself as this independent truth teller. He's on the premier platform that codes that way, right? As the independent media fighting back against the establishment. Do we actually have an independent media? How much of it is, I assume you believe he's working for the intelligence agency, Sean Ryan, as do I. How much of the independent media space do you see as really being part of that op?
So I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. Obviously, there's people that are arguably the biggest names. I think it's quite obvious that a lot of those people get sought out and bought out, or willingly collaborate, or have people that once they get big enough handle their production and their shows, their guest management, and then the person that books the guest could be the spook, and then line them up with all these people that feed them stuff. I mean, it's really hard to know, because I don't have any insight to those people, including Sean Ryan, to know exactly what category he would fit in. But obviously the history of being a former CIA contractor and having active intelligence people on and just taking whatever they say as if it's absolute reality without asking for evidence or documents or anything, sort of treating all of these currently on the payroll people as whistleblowers without any sort of leaks or actual documentation. I think it's that I don't think that's necessarily the right way to do that kind of reporting personally. Obviously I'm being very nice, but I think the clip you showed is different from the one I was commenting on. The one I was commenting on is where in that same Rogan interview he parrots this narrative that a guest on his show gave him named Sarah Adams, who's a former CIA targeting officer. Hard to know if it's really former though with some of these people. Right. She was basically echoing this narrative that because of the porous southern border, which again is not exclusive to the Biden administration, it's not like Trump hermetically sealed the border when he was in office, and you have several decades of this happening, whether it's Republican or Democrat. But the porous border has allowed Al-Qaeda operatives to enter the U.S. and establish sleeper cells because they hate us for our freedom, guys. Remember that and how real that was? Yeah. So that's very frustrating to me, because anyone who has really done their research about the national security state or our foreign wars should know that Al-Qaeda is 100% a creation of intelligence services, particularly the U.S., but I would argue also with the involvement of Israel and probably the United Kingdom as well, the great triumvirate of intelligence fuckery. I think that particular narrative that's being talked about very much right now, how convenient is that? Yes. Because I have been writing for a very long time about the efforts to implement, after the war on terror, going back to the Bush era neocons, the plans on the books were also for a war on domestic terror. And every administration, Trump included, have expanded that infrastructure significantly. Every single administration since 9/11. Okay. And it's very troubling. So if you look at the Biden administration's expansion of it and how they define domestic terrorist, it includes people who oppose government overreach, people who are opposed to any form of capitalism, right? So it could be crony capitalism, it could be stakeholder capitalism. I mean, it could be any kind of, whatever they choose to define as capitalism. You don't like the current economic system, you can be considered a domestic terrorist, or you don't like a government policy you deem to be overreach. It's very vaguely defined what gets you on the naughty list. And during the previous Trump administration, basically the infrastructure for this was expanded to include what really ultimately comes down to pre-crime, but what they like to call predictive policing. And William Barr, when he was Attorney General, made this official policy of the U.S. government. And this was not reversed by Biden, and there's no indication that the incoming Trump administration plans to revert this, even though apparently they hate Bill Barr now. But he's a career CIA mop-up man, so I really doubt that. He kind of helped clean up the Epstein mess for people, didn't he? So, the war on domestic terror, to manufacture consent for that, you have to have domestic terror, just like the war on foreign terror necessitated some sort of attack to get us to go abroad. That was the push from that. So if you have a variety of domestic attacks, which is why I say a Gladio style thing, Operation Gladio, and I'm not an expert on it, so I'm going to give just a very brief overview. Yeah,
just explain that briefly for anyone who doesn't know what that was.
Yeah, so this was basically the CIA going to Europe and being like, we don't want the European governments or the Europeans to elect governments that we deem as sympathetic to the communists, i.e. Russia or whatever. And so we're going to stage terror attacks that we blame on leftist groups or the groups adjacent to the political parties we don't want to win, and essentially use that to push Europeans to the right, and basically have them be, European governments be democratically elected, but manipulated into electing one certain party or one certain side of the political spectrum through terror, essentially, which is obviously very bad. And the intelligence services in Europe actually use these terror attacks as justification for something they never actually did, but they wanted to bring Operation Condor, then ongoing in South America, basically planned and run by the CIA, and then executed, of course, by the governments, the military dictatorships in South America under their control. They wanted to import that to Europe as a way to stop the terror attacks that these intelligence services were themselves creating, right? So
you're basically saying people are being manipulated into essentially voting for fascism. Right.
Well, that was essentially what Operation Gladio was. And it wasn't just the CIA, it was organized crime. It was also the Vatican. And you had these different groups coming together and contributing to that in specific ways. And you also had the involvement of the P2 Lodge in Italy, which is a very interesting rabbit hole for those interested in going down that. So basically a weird Freemason shadow government.
This is fucked, man.
All right. While we're down the rabbit hole, last time we were here, we had Tom O'Neill on, who wrote Chaos. And in Chaos, one of his revelations is he was doing research at the UCLA library, and he found the MK Ultra files from Gottlieb, from from Jolly West. And one of the things he found was in their correspondence, I think this was West, saying that we have successfully learned how to erase memories. These experiments have been a success. Now, the story we always hear about MK Ultra is it was a crazy attempt to create Manchurian candidates that failed. But O'Neill's research strongly suggests it actually succeeded, and they just kept that very quiet, that they actually figured out how to do these things. When you look going back to Oswald, Timothy McVeigh, and now this most recently, where you have both of these alleged attackers from the same army base, do you think there's an MK Ultra element in these attacks?
Well, it's hard to say, but I think it's absolutely a certainty that if the CIA said, "Oh, we ended that program," that's not true. If it's something that helps entrench, their power and their dominance, and by the CIA, I don't necessarily just mean the agency. I mean, like, where they come from. The CIA is a product, really, of Wall Street and the corporations that are related. It was Wall Street lawyers.
But it was Wall Street lawyers and bankers who started the CIA.
Yeah, so there's a huge overlap between CIA and the private sector, and now arguably the CIA has moved much more into the private sector, specifically with the advent of Silicon Valley. If you look into how many of those companies were started either like as CIA projects or by people with CIA ties, or any In-Q-Tel or anything like that, it's all pretty telling. But ultimately, what I'm trying to get, as far as the MK Ultra thing, it's very possible. The whole idea that they were trying to use torture and trauma to induce people into certain behaviors seems very likely that continues. And what better place to do that at something like a military base, especially one that's known for egregious sexual assaults, and I believe even murder of female soldiers and stuff like that were unsolved. Obviously there's violence happening there. And would that be directed? Obviously if it happened in the past, there's sort of this what I would call a misconception that the naughty things the CIA did in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and then that were outed during the Church Committee, the idea that that stopped anything, even though there was no accountability. Congress was totally stonewalled by the CIA, actually by William Barr, who was a lawyer for the CIA at the time. That was his main job at the time. Funny how these people pop up time and again. And it doesn't mean they stopped. There's no proof they stopped. Congress just stopped investigating. And obviously it makes sense that there was a lot of pressure applied to our political system to stop that. And, But again, unfortunately, we have to be in the realm of speculation here, because
Right.
it's not like any sort of evidence that would ultimately lead us to conclusively know that will ever be released to the public. So we're sort of stuck speculating, but we know that the lack of accountability of the CIA and the fact that they continue to do terrible things like they did decades ago, that all of this persists, and that the CIA definitely does regularly engage in torture, of people without due process and whatever. Would they use that to try and control people? And would they do it on our own soldiers? They experiment on U.S. soldiers all the time. People should look into these military, installations in the U.S. that are part of this defense innovation unit, and all this sort of merging again of Silicon Valley and the military, trying to make these transhumanist soldiers and put chips in soldiers' brains so they can control drone swarms with their minds, and like all the weird genetic engineering stuff. I mean, they're doing all of this to soldiers right now. So why wouldn't they? And that's like admitted. It's not like the mainstream media like reports on it, but if you look for it, it's there, So why wouldn't they, try mind control by different means, or even use those same means that allow them to control drone swarms with their brains, use that to manipulate soldiers in a different direction? I mean, they're about to be commercialized, the brain chips. So why wouldn't, they covertly use them on people?
So now
We don't know.
You've spoken a lot about how many people have reversed themselves on civil liberties, on their beliefs about the FBI. I think you've seen that really, really in sharp relief since the election. I did a whole segment about Mark Andreessen doing this whole round of calling everything that restrains.
He's Dr. Robotnik without the mustache.
He's
basically.
Talking about everything that restrains him is woke. So you saw this. I went to the Dissident Dialogues, which was like this IDW conference in May. And it was very eye-opening for me, because it was basically pairing the anti-woke stuff, DEI and trans, with, and Uyghur labor might be in your supply chain. So it was this very Jake Sullivan State Department kind of foreign policy, paired with ginning up outrage about cultural issues. And we saw this deployed immediately after New Year's Eve. You have End Wokeness immediately, this big account in that space. New York City, just a few hours after a jihadist killed 15 in New Orleans. Now, this rally had been planned in advance, had nothing to do with ISIS or anything like that. But immediately they frame it as if this was to celebrate this attack in New Orleans.
I mean, after 9/11, they took an old film of Palestinians being handed candy by some like NGO and said that was Palestinians celebrating 9/11. This is an old trope.
Right. But what's new about that, although I guess this isn't really new, Nixon and Agnew presented themselves as fighting against the establishment in some way. So you wrote this, which I think sums it up pretty well, and I'd like you to elaborate on it. Some of the same prominent people who rightly have been pointing out that the FBI and CIA are deeply corrupt, which they obviously are now saying we should believe those agencies about the motives and identities of those behind the recent attacks, and also believe FBI, CIA people that the U.S. is now infiltrated and invested with al-Qaeda operatives poised to bring chaos to the U.S. in 2025. Even more odd, some of these people used to rant for hours about how al-Qaeda and ISIS were creations of the U.S. government, either directly or indirectly. Funny how narrative management works. Al-Qaeda is definitely a U.S. creation, and fear over current and or future attacks will be used to market a complete techno-tyranny takeover. You'll be told the digital ID, digital surveillance money, and Palantir big data pre-crime algos are the only ways to stop the terror attacks, and it will be disturbing to see how many fall for the ruse. Don't give in to the fear and don't consent. Digital ID and many of these technologies will only stick if you voluntarily comply and adopt them. So that's a pretty terrifying future that you're describing. You're giving some prescription for how to avoid it, but yes.
I'm not trying to be terrifying. I'm trying to be realistic of the problems that can arise when you give your brain in a bag over to intelligence-linked billionaires and CIA frontmen, and where they plan overtly to take us. So, arguably there is this effort, and we saw it during COVID, for all of these quote unquote solutions to be rolled out that had nothing to do with viral infections. And arguably, things like vaccine passports had nothing to do with whether you were, it wasn't really based on public health policy. It was arguably a trial run for digital ID infrastructure, which is meant to be applied to health, among other things. And then things like the pre-crime algorithms of Palantir have been in testing for a long time. Predictive policing specifically, mainly in minority dominant communities in New Orleans and Los Angeles. Very biased, very messed up algorithms, but they were also used to distribute, vaccines during the COVID era, and decided which communities need the most, and then pushed those vaccines to the same minorities that they had targeted previously through predictive policing and ICE and things like that. Digital IDs, are advancing rapidly, including from people that claim to be against vaccine passports and all this stuff during COVID, like Ron DeSantis, for example. Florida is advancing very quickly to the digital driver's license world, the Florida Smart ID card, and all of this. And so arguably really the only difference is the sales pitch at this point. So, I've argued for, well over a year now that they saw resistance to it the way it was being pitched during the COVID era. And so because ultimately we are governed and ruled by a public-private partnership, they move it out of the public sector and more into the private sector, left to right. It's the same type of ping pong. And so ultimately, now the sales pitch is going to be meant to appeal to the demographic that complained the most about that, right-leaning Americans,
Right.
Give them a sales pitch that they're more likely to swallow. So that would be, this is the solution to crime, rampant crime. This is the solution to illegal immigration. And what better way to push that even further on over than arguing, having this sort of milieu of all these ISIS, Al-Qaeda terror attacks, blame that on the border and be like, well, we need to know who everyone is that's coming in or out, which is already a policy Trump campaigned on this cycle, the very precise biometric entry-exit tracking system, he called it. And that's, essentially a recipe for digital ID, not just for the border, but all ports of entry. And TSA has been moving in this direction for some time, and that clear private sector equivalent, in airport security has been there to sort of normalize the whole biometric stuff. And it's really ultimately part of this global plan that's part of Interpol, that every country in the world has basically agreed to the implementation of what Interpol calls the global policing goals, which a lot of people, I would recommend you should read about those. They're rather interesting. And, if they keep pushing this narrative enough about Al-Qaeda, for example, we need to go after terror financing. Well, now
Right.
we need visibility into every dollar spent everywhere in the country. And you can then sell, a digital, cashless, surveillable, programmable even society. And, with pre-crime, the ultimate goal of total information awareness, the DARPA program that Palantir repackaged as a private sector thing, the goal of that was to stop terror attacks before it happened. But then they also wanted to apply that to stop pandemics before they happen. There was this multi-tier goal, you could argue, and the anthrax attacks right after 9/11 were all part of this. Actually, it was intended with the anthrax attacks to have multiple bioterror events happen after that, but lo and behold, the anthrax was traced back to a U.S. military before they could convince everyone that it had actually come from Iraq. And so that operation kind of got folded, but you can see that that was ultimately the plan. And so if this narrative is sort of about Al-Qaeda sleeper cells being activated or whatever, is sort of predictive programming for some sort of American Gladio thing, which I certainly hope it is not. But if it is, the goal is to have people so scared and so freaked out and feel so insecure that they'll be willing to trade their remaining liberties and freedom for that. And ultimately, a lot of these things, particularly digital ID, are really the linchpin in leading us into this digital transformation era that has a lot of names, that some of them turn people off, like the Great Reset and whatever. But ultimately, the goal is to lead people into this fourth industrial revolution, which is basically sort of this post-human future where AI basically runs everything and the tech overlords rule over us. And they're trying to convince a lot of people right now that they will be benevolent overlords, and they're so cool, and they're anti-woke, like you pointed out earlier. It's kind of funny, like Elon Musk basically like pisses off a huge amount of what he has cultivated as his base, Trump's base basically, and then is like, well, I'll just come back and make memes and talk about how I'm going to reach level 80 in the Path of Exile video game. And, maybe tomorrow I'll tweet about how Disney turned a beloved character into a different race, and then they'll be back in my corner again. I mean, it's very easy for these people to play you, and they've been doing it for years. But they have... Yeah,
I don't know how much you've been online the last couple days, but no sooner did they start to lose the love of the peasants, they started really asking questions about these New Year's Eve attacks and how weird a lot of the surrounding incidents, like the reporter walking through the apartment were. And all of a sudden, this, and I'm not saying the story is not true, but anyone who really looks into these kinds of things knows about these grooming gangs in England. This is This is not a new story.
Right.
All of a sudden, in the last 24 hours, oh my God, this is what we need to be obsessed with right now. And
nobody's going to give me shit for
has
going
like
after
10
rape
tweets
gangs,
about
so I may
this
as well
today.
do that. Yeah, right. Nobody's going to give me shit for that, right? That's something.
Right.
Well,
who's going to come at me for that?
What about the pedo grooming gang that was run by Israel in the U.S.?
Yeah.
Well,
they're not mentioning that.
No,
but I mean,
won't.
so it sounds like the upshot here is that they're basically 10 steps ahead of the public, and the public has no idea whatsoever, right? Because the other thing, and this is what always, I mean, you're a wealth of knowledge on this. I'm obviously not, but intuitively, I just could not help but recoil when people said in the run up to the presidential vote, and I didn't vote for either of the major candidates, so I'm not here to advocate for one or the other or really compare them. But the idea that we had to elect Trump to save the country just seemed absurd on its face. It seemed absolutely absurd because of this. Because now you have, intuitively, you could just sense the merger of not only capital with the state, but tech capital with the state. I mean, and to go back to what we talked to at the beginning of the interview, a streamlined government, not only is it not necessarily a smaller government, it can very easily become a larger government.
And less efficient if the algorithms don't work.
Well, that too, but also like once that infrastructure is there, let's say the pendulum swings and someone who wants to greatly expand government power, who says that outright, the tools are all there for them to do that.
There, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
All right.
Yeah.
You want to go to the Trump question?
Sure. Yeah. So speaking of Trump, actually, Donald Trump recently called on the CIA to act to sort of stabilize the country in the wake of these New Year's Eve, New Year's
What do
Day
you know?
terror attacks. Yes. So, I mean, this is kind of a broad question, but was Trump ever a target of the deep state? And do you believe that the intelligence services were behind the attempts on his life over the summer?
So I didn't pay very close attention to the exact narratives and anomalies with the Trump assassination attempts, but I did notice that before they started, that there was a lack of enthusiasm among Trump's base because people still sort of remembered what had happened the first time around, and weren't necessarily as enthusiastic because he proved himself the first time around. He wasn't really the anti-establishment maverick he had sold himself as being. But of course, the assassination attempts, whether you believe that they were authentic or not, ultimately had the end result of convincing people that Trump is indeed anti-establishment. But then you have people, the ultimate deep state people, supposedly after Trump, like former CIA director under Obama, John Brennan, being like, actually, Trump is actually doing some cool stuff. I don't know. And all these, if it was really the deep state after him, subsequent those things, and after the election victory, I just find it hard to believe that you would believe in the omnipower of the quote unquote deep state, and then he gets elected and really nothing happens. And people are speculating that the Al Qaeda thing and all of that, is something to complicate Trump before he gets into office. But I mean, if you have any experience with this stuff, as particularly the use of Al Qaeda as a CIA boogeyman, the goal of it is to equate U.S. foreign policy interests with Israeli foreign policy or regional, in Israel's case, interests, and really the idea that it's October 7th style attacks, for example, and then the idea that all of a sudden conflating ISIS with Palestine and a lot of the other stuff that's happened sort of has the markings of sort of, instead of a plan to stop Trump's foreign policy plan, a way to sort of tee him up for some sort of, extended military presence or new war in the Middle East. And if he does that, I anticipate they will wind Ukraine down, just as they wound Afghanistan down before they started Ukraine. They will do the same to divert resources to that particular area. But you have to get Trump's base that is tired of foreign wars and elected him allegedly to stop foreign wars excited about a foreign war. So you have to manufacture that. It seems more like a tee up than an attempt to derail an agenda, especially when his Secretary of Defense nominee is an enthusiastic promoter of the idea of blowing up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and replacing it with a third temple, which a lot of the extremists in Netanyahu's cabinet have been very vocal about doing. And that's also in and of itself a very complex topic, but I'll leave it there for now.
I mean, to me, you could tell the whole story right there.
She's his Citibank.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Sheldon Adelson essentially, had a lot of control, almost complete control, arguably, over foreign policy under Trump the first time. He's the person that had H.R. McMaster switched out for John Bolton when Trump was in last time, for example. So I'm sure Miriam Adelson helped pick the national security advisor this time around, who is a shameless neocon, basically Lindsey Graham, but just not named Lindsey Graham, and so I don't really think Trump was planning, if you look at his appointees, to have a not neocon foreign policy agenda. But a lot of this rhetoric circulating right now seems to benefit what his intended policies were going to be going into it, not necessarily a way to stop him. But to go back to the question of, was the deep state ever after him? I've never really done this on an interview before, but I'll give you my whole spiel about how I view Donald Trump. So, I mentioned Trump a bit in my Epstein book, but not extensively. And I probably should have mentioned a bit more. And I also didn't have all the information at the time when I published it. But essentially, Trump was bailed out by this particular bank, Rothschild Inc., which was basically the Wall Street branch of the Rothschild banking dynasty in Europe that was set up, I believe, in the late 70s, early 1980s, basically run by this guy named Robert Peary. And they basically became a big mergers and acquisitions firm on Wall Street. And they picked a handful of people to sort of be their emissaries into the world of M&As. In the United States. And the two people, they picked three people. One of them was James Goldsmith, who's a distant cousin of the Rothschilds. He's a currency trader. He was actually one of the earliest ties of Epstein to sort of the world of elite society back in the early 70s. And a good friend of Robert Maxwell, who was the second figure picked for this. That would be Ghislaine Maxwell's father. And then the third one, I forget his name, but he was a business associate of Robert Maxwell in that time. Robert Maxwell sort of enters the U.S. in 1990 and it sort of tries to establish a foothold in New York City. He's courted by these figures that later form, a year later after Maxwell dies, the Mega Group, as it's called, which was founded by Leslie Wexner and Charles Bronfman. It includes a lot of these other figures that in media in 1990 were openly courting Robert Maxwell. And Robert Maxwell, with the help of Rothschild Inc., sort of acquires Macmillan and makes a big foothold into New York and brings Ghislaine with him. And so he dies in 1991, and Ghislaine and Epstein team up, right? But then also around the same time, Trump falls into bankruptcy, and Trump had a lot of associations with the same New York world, sort of that combines the remnants, I guess you could say, of the Jewish mob via Roy Cohn. and sort of
Right.
in that organized crime milieu that was also connected to political power. Roy Cohn was Trump's mentor, for example. So Trump is in this major bankruptcy situation, and he's bailed out by Rothschild Inc. The main banker to do that is Wilbur Ross, who Trump later rewards with a post as Commerce Secretary in his first term, even though he was extremely geriatric and fell asleep at a bunch of meetings. It was obviously a favor repay, if you ask me. But anyway, when the bankers were interviewed about why they bailed out Trump, because it didn't make any economic sense for them, and they weren't really a bankruptcy firm, or distressed asset firm. They were like, well, we did it because the Trump name is an asset. The name Trump, him as a person, is an asset to us. And if you look at how Trump governed the first time, very adjacent and arguably beholden to Israel, which has a lot of connections to the same organized crime milieu who helped, arm it, during the Haganah and Irgun phases before the founding of the state of Israel. And so, I would argue that Trump is very, very much beholden to that particular interest group, because he wouldn't really exist as he exists today without them. And it's also worth pointing out, I have an article coming out about this later. So the actual person who is responsible for the Black Book being made public, well, it was published by Nick Bryant and Gawker. And I think I actually had to do something with Peter Thiel taking down Gawker, because Thiel and Epstein were meeting in that same period of time that the Black Book was published. But it was Epstein's butler that acquired that book and tried to shop it around. And then one of the the Epstein victim lawyers, Brad Edwards, reported him to the FBI. And then this guy gets sent to prison. He dies in prison in 2015, the same year that, Trump is becoming a political candidate, and Gawker gets shut down and all of this. Sorry, my spiel is long, and I must pause for water.
I'm getting thirsty just listening.
Yeah,
I'm out of water myself.
But if you go and you actually read the Black Book,
so you mentioned Jewish mobsters. There's still a synagogue on the Lower East Side that lights a candle to Bugsy Siegel. And that's part of the reason, because he gave so much money to Israel.
Well, he also gave a lot of weapons to Israel. And so did the Bronfman family. They finance a lot of the weapon shipments and have a long-standing tie to organized crime. It's controversial to talk about, but it is history. And if the U.S. has a deep state, Israel most certainly has one as well. So just leave it there. But anyway, I forgot exactly where I was. And my Trump spiel here. Okay. So the butler, in Epstein's Black Book.
It's always the butler. The butler did it.
Yeah. Well, he annotated the book, and he circled a bunch of names that he said were involved in the case. And this is, of course, years before Trump was a political candidate. And actually, Trump is one of the circled names, and no one's ever really been interested in talking about that, which I think is interesting. We don't really know, but there are some interesting ties there. Is it possible? I think it is clear that the two of them broke ties in the mid 2000s. I think it was like 2005 or 2006, somewhere in that ballpark. But it was over a real estate. They wanted the same piece of real estate in Palm Beach, and that sort of ruined their friendship. It doesn't mean they didn't do terrible things together before, potentially. Right. And there's a lot of evidence that they were very, very close in the 1980s and throughout most of the 1990s. Maxwell and Epstein claim that they were set him up with Melania, his current wife. And also Epstein had ties to his girlfriend before Melania, Selena Middelfart, who's a Norwegian heiress with an unfortunate last name.
That's a tough one.
Yeah. But I mean, essentially what people overlook with Epstein is that he wasn't just, abusing these girls with very few resources and promising them a lot of stuff and then exploiting them sexually and pimping them out to powerful people. He was also basically pimping out women that he did fund their education and did help make them refined women or whatever, and then basically marketed them off to powerful people as wives. So Trump is potentially very controlled by Israel, or at least this particular organized crime faction entity that has a lot of influence in both countries. And really, there hasn't been a lot of interest in looking at it very closely from really, I don't know, anyone. And it's I take the L here because I should have looked more closely at the annotations of the Black Book before my book came out, and I did not really do that.
Well, those books of yours were too short. I mean, that's what people say about them.
Well, I had a very short deadline.
I have it sitting on my nightstand right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, honestly, I wrote that book. Well, volume 1, I basically co-wrote with Ed Berger, who's an amazing researcher, because it was just the scope I wanted to do and the time I wanted to do it. It wasn't feasible. But yeah, I had basically like a year to write that book. And It was very crazy. And I just had a baby. Yeah. Well, it was
you had a baby. What's that?
Well, it was a while ago, but it was when I was writing the book. So the book came out in September 2021.
So while you were writing, okay.
My son was born at the end of 2021, so it was a lot to juggle. It was pretty.
It's
insane.
impressive that you can do all this.
Well, thank you, but I did leave stuff out. So I'm looking at the possibility of doing a hardcover edition where I fill in a lot of the gaps that I wasn't able to get to. When I actually wrote the book, because I basically had to stop my whole Epstein timeline at 2006, 2007 at his first arrest. I didn't have time to go into everything that happened after that. Right. I have lots of articles on Unlimited Hangout and elsewhere that go into some of the stuff that happened after, but unfortunately an exhaustive piece of work I unfortunately don't have in that direction yet.
All right,
yeah, but anyway,
fortunately we have an incoming FBI director who is going to reveal all of this. He's going to blow the lid off the whole thing, the whole Epstein thing. He's going to follow the paper trail. So a lot of people believe
he's going to tell Americans to wake up and support Israel also.
Yeah,
so I'm sure he'll really get to the bottom of it.
So here's a clip of him talking about how he's going to break the FBI.
His footprint has gotten so freaking big, and the biggest problem the FBI has come out of its intel shops. I'd break that component out of it. I'd shut down the FBI Hoover building on day one and reopening the next day as a museum of the deep state. And I'd take the 7,000 employees that work in that building and send them across America to chase down criminals. Go be cops. You're cops. Go be cops. Go chase down murderers and drug dealers and violent offenders. What do you need 7,000 people there for? Same thing with DOJ. What are all these people doing here? Looking for the next government promotion, looking for their next fancy government title, looking for their parachute out of government. So while you're bringing in the right people, you also have to shrink government.
All right, so hey, why are you such a negative Nancy there? Cash is on the case.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm inherently skeptical of these people, and I remember what happened at the DOJ last time Trump was in office. I mean, supposedly he's learned his lesson and didn't actually pick those people or whatever. But if it comes to hunting down any sort of crime that involves, the intelligence services of a particular country, the size of New Jersey in the Middle East, I don't think Kash Patel or Tulsi Gabbard has any interest in doing that based on their statements in the past year and a half. And certainly a lot of the other rhetoric vocalized by essentially every other nominee in the Trump administration leads me to that conclusion as well. And that's something that wouldn't be exclusive to a Trump administration either. Essentially, Democrat administrations also turn a blind eye to that type of stuff as well. So as far as any truth coming about the Epstein case, if there are releases, I think they will be politically useful to the people that are releasing them. I don't necessarily expect blanket releases. Why? Because, I don't think Epstein was exclusively working for Israel. I think he definitely did. But I think, just like Robert Maxwell, he had ties to multiple intelligence services, and it includes American intelligence and also a lot of very powerful people on Wall Street heavily relied on Epstein for a lot of stuff. A lot of my work really points to him having been really a financial terrorist more than he even was a sex blackmailer. That sex blackmailing was secondary to the financial crimes that he committed on behalf of very powerful billionaires linked to organized crime, like Leslie Wexner. And, there's evidence that he did that for the Bronfmans as well. And that led to him being ousted from Bear Stearns in the early 1980s. But there's also a lot of evidence that he was personally involved with the collapse of Bear Stearns in 2008 that led to this big wealth transfer that benefited a lot of people in this particular network. What do you know?
Well, to your point, and the last question, one more cabinet member you've been speaking about. Now, for almost as long as I can remember, at least in my adult life, George Soros has been enemy number one for the entire
Sure.
spectrum of the right wing, the entire spectrum from MAGA to Mitch McConnell, Fox News to Newsmax. They all agree on George Soros. So I don't understand why anybody who supported Trump or believes he's anti-establishment or is taking on the establishment didn't realize the fix was in as soon as he names Scott Bessent as Treasury Secretary, whose career was mainly spent at the George Soros hedge fund, and who was heavily involved in probably George Soros's most infamous trick, crashing
Sure.
the British
Oh, he
pound.
was. He ran the London office.
Right.
Yeah.
So what does this say about Trump's deep state dismantling agenda that he appointed a George Soros flunky as Treasury Secretary?
Well, here's the commonality and what helps it all make sense. Who basically capitalized George Soros's first fund back in like the 60s or whatever? The Evelyn de Rothschild banking interests at
Did
Bank
they?
de Privy. And basically, what has George Soros done most of his career? How did he make his money? Currency speculating. What did people like Jeffrey Epstein do that worked for that same network? Currency speculating. Jimmy Goldsmith, who I mentioned earlier with Rothschild Inc., currency trading, who was considered and named by the New York Times to be part of a currency trading cabal that involved people like Joe Lewis, who broke the British pound with George Soros. The currency speculators, no one really looks into them and their ties to oligarchs or intelligence agencies. They're sort of treated as these, super smart Wall Street guys. Well, where do you think they get the intelligence from to make those trades? Or how do you think, they're able to facilitate these like massive shorts and make these massive bets and actually have that translate into something? And how do they get this? How are they unaccountable? Because there was a time too when like Soros and some of these other guys were basically collapsing economies all around the world. There was calls for accountability and something to make that not happen, and nothing was done. And that means the prevailing global power structure saw nothing wrong with that or was directly benefiting from that. I think that's pretty clear. So George Soros he's been a convenient boogeyman, and he's certainly been involved in a lot of terrible things, among them financing color revolutions, for example. But you don't think color revolutions are also financed by, I don't know, cutouts for the CIA, like the National Endowment for Democracy, or even like neocon leaning groups that they like regime change just as much as anybody else, right? So, again, it's convenient boogeyman lightning rod type character, and this just shows you how a lot of people in conservative media are just willing to roll over when someone who you arguably couldn't be closer to Soros than Scott Bessent, because it's not just that he was like a key part of Soros's businesses and funds throughout, from the early 90s through the 2000s. He got put in charge. He was promoted very heavily to the very top. And then in the early 2000s, I believe he left and like had his own thing for a while, but it was capitalized almost entirely by George Soros. So he owed Soros for that independent venture, right? And then he comes back and is appointed to run the Soros family office while they're actively doing color revolution stuff and getting shit on by conservative media. Scott Bessent was head of that. Right. And then, his current thing, Key Square, I forget exactly what it's called, but that was also largely capitalized by Soros money as well. And most of its founding employees with Bessent that Bessent brought on were also all from Soros world. That doesn't seem like someone who had a falling out with Soros and doesn't like him anymore. He owes his whole career to him, dude. And so it's like, I think it's just desperate. Kind of a desperate attempt to write off a terrible nominee as something other than what it really is. And you have people like, the ex-BlackRock guy, Ed Dowd, and some of these people that became prominent during COVID sort of promoting this idea that he's not really adjacent to Soros anymore. But I don't know. Let's wait and see, because ultimately, Trump is beholden to bankers at the end of the day. And I think it was very clear in his first administration, he serves Wall Street giants. When the COVID crisis was happening, and even before it happened, COVID fiscal policy, Trump and Mnuchin gave all of that power over to Larry Fink at BlackRock to run. And they started printing all this money that later was written off as COVID fiscal relief. They started doing it like 6 months before COVID was even declared a pandemic. They started the wealth transfer way before. They started it back in, like, I think September 2019, when the repo market went crazy and the New York Fed started to intervene to keep that afloat. Called the Going Direct Plan. If anyone's interested, you can look up John Titus's work on Going Direct. I think it's hosted on Catherine Austin Fitt's Solari report. Very disturbing stuff. And Trump, Larry Fink was Trump's personal money manager for a long time, and he's a big fan of Larry. And essentially also in the Obama administration in 2008, BlackRock was tapped in to be crisis fiscal management. And during the election in 2024, unlike most other famous people, instead of being like, this election will decide the future of everything and whether our country blows up or is a sunshine unicorn paradise, Larry Fink was like, well, actually it doesn't really matter because we work with both administrations and they both do whatever we say. So,
BlackRock wins again.
Yeah, but it's not just BlackRock, BlackRock is not just the big bag entity of Wall Street. It's like a symptom of Wall Street. It happens to be the biggest asset manager, but it's not like they're a constellation unto themselves, completely isolated from the rest of it, and the rest of the guys are unlike BlackRock. Like, no way. It's complicated. Larry Fink openly says that he wants totalitarian governments basically because there's less risk in them. And his whole career is mitigating risk ever since he got fired from First Boston and made the Aladdin algorithm and created BlackRock. It's all been about risk mitigation. So ultimately, what he pushes for is something that's creating the lowest risk market and environment possible, which is, as he openly says, totalitarian and authoritarian governance. So that's kind of disturbing that that's someone that has such major fiscal influence over the U.S. And it was Fink that was tapped by the Trump transition team, led by Cantor Fitzgerald's Howard Lutnick, to pick who the Treasury Secretary would be. And even Lutnick was even vying for the title of Treasury Secretary with Bessent and then got Commerce, which is interesting because there's now legislation in Congress trying to give Commerce all oversight over artificial intelligence in the country. That'll be interesting. But, it's a double standard. And actually, speaking of with Bessent and Soros and all of this, and another interesting double standard is who I just brought up, Howard Lutnick, who has a joint venture, a firm he chairs and leads with a Chinese state-owned firm called China Credit Trust, which is the same Chinese state-owned firm that Hunter Biden was involved with through his firm, Rosemont Seneca, had a joint venture with something called Harvest Fund Management, whose main shareholder was China Credit Trust. So Lutnick's tied to that particular CCP entity is much closer than Hunter Biden's was. And Mark Goodwin and I reported on this last month, and guess how many people in right-wing media cared at all? Zero.
Well, that's what's crazy. All of these people that they were so deeply suspicious of whenever they're associated with a Democrat or a liberal, they just go right to sleep when all these same ties are there with Donald Trump. Like the idea that this represents the people's triumph over the deep state. It's absurd what's the clearest statement of intent? The appointments. Look at who he's appointing.
Well, I think it's an effort, to coax people. All this rhetoric and stuff is to get people agitated. And then when their guy wins, yes, now relax back into the armchair and trust the plan. And then you have all the talking heads that got them worked up before being like, actually, here's 5 reasons why this is actually fine, even though it's totally not. And both sides do that. And the same, argument you brought up earlier that was used to get Trump voters in line. This is will decide the fate of our country and whether we blow up in great doom fire or not. That was the same stuff used on Democrats in the previous election. So, they use it all the time, the same tactics. They'll just switch parties. So maybe the amount of time it was used on Republicans wasn't 4 years prior. It was maybe 8 year, whatever, a little more time. So they've had time to forget about how it's been used on them. Right. But they switch it around all the time because it's fear, right? Fear is a very powerful motivator. And that's sort of the underlying connection here for most of the things we've been talking about today, right? Is that, fear makes people not think critically and willing to surrender things they normally would not surrender if they are very afraid. So if some of this information bothers you, the best thing you can do is not give in to the fear. And the best thing you can do is use your voluntary power to choose what you do and not do. And if you really want to not have this turn into some weird technocratic PayPal mafia, transhumanist hellhole. Stop using the services that make these people money as much as possible. And don't comply with stuff that leads to that kind of system. And obviously, the foundation of that is digital ID. It'll be the same playbook perhaps as vaccine passports. Without a digital ID, I can't go to the movie theater. I can't go to a restaurant. I can't fly. I can't do this and that. But if we have to do that for a bit, it's better than sleepwalking into tyranny that will be very hard to extricate ourselves from once we are in it, right? It's much easier to prepare for being cut off from society for a bit, because if enough people don't comply, it will fail. These types of things only will work if they have a vibrant user base. That's true for the, CBDCs or private sector stablecoins that are basically private sector CBDCs, private bank CBDC, digital currencies, I guess. If people aren't using them, it's not going to work. So find something else to use, or just find a way to not use these things at all as much as possible, because that is the power we have. And that's why so much manipulation is happening, targeting either side of the political spectrum to get us to voluntarily acquiesce to these policies. And my other piece of advice would be to separate rhetoric from policy. Politicians lie. People are figuring that out this election cycle now that the honeymoon is mostly over. Right? But they do, and you have to pay attention to policy instead of rhetoric. These people go on podcasts that are independent, and they speak a good game, and they say the stuff you want to hear, so that you don't pay attention to what they actually do once they're in power. You think, any sort of technocratic advancement or bad policy is going to get a bunch of outrage from the Sean Ryan show or Joe Rogan? It seems very unlikely, All
right. Whitney, thank you very much. It was amazing meeting you. Thank you for giving us an uplifting ending. Fight the transhumanism.
There you go.
Fight the stable coins.
Well, the best way, really quick though, the best way to fight transhumanism, the whole post-human idea, is to create something. Because basically, AI is being set up as a way for us to outsource our souls, our creativity. So make sure you create as much as possible, whatever that means for you. We all create different stuff. Maybe you like, to make little trinkets or whittle wood or whatever. Maybe you paint, maybe you make music. I don't know. But that's the best way to fight the AI transhumanist crushing doom, is to not surrender your soul and just become an algorithm zombie. Do something with what you've got, Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Where they can find you before you sign off? Where can people find you?
Those are words to live by.
Thanks. Well, for now, I am on Twitter, but I will be getting off sooner rather than later, because Elon Musk has made it very clear what his plan is: American WeChat, whatever that means, and verifying all humans, which is linking your account to a government issued ID. Do not do that, because it will make Palantir's job a million times easier. They probably know who you are anyway, even if you're anonymous on social media accounts, but they can't legally prosecute you for it. But because of the Constitution that's in the way of all of this. But if you link your government issued ID to that, they in theory could, and there are policies on the books. Again, they came in the Trump administration initially, expanded under Biden, to use your social media posts under the guise of predictive policing to stop mass shootings or stop terror or stop crime before it happens. Don't make it easy on them. Yeah. So anyway, I'm on that for now, but that is a huge red line for me, and I will be off as soon as that happens. And it's looking increasingly soon, as we're seeing the whole verified, unverified,
it's in beta
apartheid structure happening on Twitter. Yeah. Well, I have a blue check without wanting it, because if you pass a certain follower count, they just give one to you. But it's obviously. Yeah, so it's obvious, but it's obviously at
unless
this point,
you take issue with H-1B visas.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it'll be another issue another day, So it's at the whim of him and his PayPal friends, whether I keep it or not, right? So I don't really care, but I'm there because it's very hard to distribute information otherwise. That's why Unlimited Hangout, my site, is looking at doing things that are not digital, like a print magazine. And things like that. Well, yeah, because also people need to remember to read instead of just watch TikTok slop all the time. Use your brain or you will lose it. That's what they're counting on. Read the Kissinger-Schmidt AI book. They basically are like, yes, AI will cognitively diminish people, and then you'll all be easily controllable because you'll stop using your brain.
Well,
so use your brain. and
that
get offline as much as you possibly can. We can't, it's very hard for people to live totally offline existences depending on what your job is. But there are things you can do to mitigate your dependence on these people. And, you know, there's something we all can do. But anyway, yeah, I'm on X for now. I have a Telegram channel, at least Unlimited Hangout does. It's under Unlimited Hangout. You can follow my newsletter on Unlimited Hangout. Ideally do that, and then you take out the whole social media man anyway, which is really a major problem with the alternative media landscape right now, because we talked about it earlier. There are people, sure, who are bought out, but there's also people who are slaves to the algorithm, to clickbait, to monetization, and all of that. And it's really been really damaging, I think, overall to the quality of the output of alternative media. So if we can move away from that as much as possible, I think the better off we will be in the so-called info war. So yes, Unlimited Hangout is where you can find me. Please sign up for the newsletter. Thank you.
All right. Great to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Likewise. Take care.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for your patience with my tech difficulties.
Thank you for being
problem.
so generous with your time.
No problem.
All right. Great to meet you.
Take care.
Whitney Webb, everybody.
Right,
Wow.
the great Whitney Webb.
The great Whitney Webb. Wow, that was great. All right, folks, we got plenty more show for you. We're going to switch to Rumble just a second. I just want to take some super chats before we go over there. Mortar Socialist Movement. Thanks to the $5. Our organization uses Whitney's reporting in Middle Earth. You'd be surprised how effective these Western power structure models are in the world of magic. There you go. Tracy Scott says, Jimmy, will you speak to Ashton Forbes when it breaks that the Cybertruck whistleblowers patent is linked to AAI cooperation in 2009, started by 6 people? They call me Rex. Says the historiography of Stalin has changed since the 21st century. Will you bring Grover Furr or Samantha Lom, PhD, on your show? I'll have to pass that up to the big man. I like this one from Sparky. Russell and Keaton were able to avoid Whitney on their show with the same deft skill they avoided Aaron Mate, but they don't control the Jimmy Dore show, so they have to face her. Will Whitney expose them as CIA stooges? Thank you, Sparky. Javier Milei is a hardcore globalist who acted like Trump to get elected. He's already betrayed Argentina by sneaking their gold reserves to the UK to be held hostage. Right Thur says, Whitney thoughts on Chile tracking everyone's activities via RUT number. In USA, surrendering data is voluntary, whereas in Chile, it's mandatory. Brad Gilbert says Elon's grandpa was a leader of the Social Credit Party and Technocracy in Canada. Technocracy Inc. in Canada, pardon me. CCP Argentina are beta tests for this. BRICS versus US dollar is fake, just a Hegelian dialect to convince MAGA to accept CBDC. Bricktop says Whitney Webb was right. Sparky says, keep in mind, Israel has killed many more Americans than Iran. Remember the USS Liberty. All right, we will take some more super chats and Rumble rants and the like over on Rumble, but we do have to switch over there right now. So, Andrew, we can play an ad and switch over to Rumble, and we'll see you guys over there for the rest of the program.
Hey, a lot of us are trying to get our finances in order to start the year off right. And there's some great news for homeowners. Interest rates have dropped and are now